Magic and Mystery by Alfred Thompson. Chapter 1. Origins of Superstition. The prevalence of superstition within a nation depends significantly upon its climate, temperament, religion, and occupational pursuits. Conceptions regarding supernatural entities or phenomena, although generally predicated upon a singular foundational characteristic shared across all nations, diverge so fundamentally respecting the form, disposition, habits, and capacities of these beings that they appear to derive from exceedingly disparate origins. The progression of knowledge and the principles of evolution have virtually persuaded us that belief in the supernatural is merely a fabrication of the human intellect, imprinted upon the imaginations of our forebears during epochs when such impressions were prone to be potent and enduring, and subsequently transmitted through the inexorable certainty of the laws of heredity. Legends have perpetually been perceived through the lenses of varying prejudices and impressions. They have continually transmuted in accordance with the media and perspectives through which they have been observed. Hence arises their diverse form, character, and attributes across various nations, alongside the frequent absence of rational analogy concerning them even within a single region. Where, presently, are the multitudinous creations of ancient Greek and Roman mythologies? Where are their Laras, demons, Penates, their fauns, satyrs, nymphs, dryads, hamadryads, gods and goddesses? And yet, the peasantry of the two most enlightened nations of antiquity were so resolutely anchored in the belief of their distinct and individual existence that their veneration constituted an essential component of their religious practices. Who, in the contemporary era, maintains belief in a faun or a dryad? They dissolved into their true essence, nothingness, before the luster of Christian enlightenment, only, alas, to be supplanted by newer concepts and imagery, perhaps purer in nature, yet undoubtedly superstitious. Fear and hope are the primal emotions that render humanity superstitious. Man harbors doubts regarding his immortality, his intellect is finite, and his superstition fluctuates in direct proportion to his readiness for death. Every truth is subjected to abuse and perversion by human moral delinquencies. Consequently, an unfounded dread of ghosts, apparitions, and future states emerges as a derivative of the doctrine of our immortality. The ancient monsters of mythology vanished before the advent of reason and religion. It remains the pressing question of the hour as to what shall succeed a Christianity that either requires comprehensive reform or must be recorded as a failure. The current epoch is frequently characterized as an age of materialism, wherein modern science boasts of having dismantled antiquated superstitious convictions. Yet, it remains curious how persistently archaic traditions and fancies emerge amidst the most prosaic environments of modern existence. There are undeniably many individuals in the present day whose faith in invisible agencies remains impervious to the accumulated learning of the ages. Educated persons still attend spirit-rapping seances and cultivate numerous minor superstitious observances. To spill salt or to seat 13 at a table is deemed as objectionable in this enlightened century as it ever was during the epoch we are pleased to designate as the Dark Ages. The appearance of 2 or 3 magpies, hares crossing one's path, the sudden cracking of furniture, the howling of dogs, the donning of the left shoe first, the ticking sound of the insect known as the death watch in decaying wood, and 100 other occurrences have lost none of the pagan pungency that renders them susceptible to belief. We may bestow different appellations upon our superstitions, yet we cling to them nonetheless. Matters that admit of no rational explanation must perpetually confound and provoke anxiety. A profound fascination envelopes those subjects upon which no coherent theory has ever been formulated, subjects whose nerves and fibers have never yet been laid bare by the forceps and scalpels of microscopic science. It is to a systematic survey of such esoteric subjects that the subsequent chapters of this modest work shall be devoted. Chapter 2. Ancient Magic and Deception. The effects of electricity upon the animal system and the atmosphere bear significant responsibility for our superstitious observances. Animal magnetism, a subject that remains largely inchoate, harbors the power and potential for future feats of wonder. Much like the practices observed among certain African and North American tribes in the present day, a substantial portion of our forebears' magic, formerly designated as medicine, consisted of manipulating the fears and imaginations of patients through the utilization of purported charms and mystical inspirations. Contemporary beliefs in faith healing serve, to a considerable degree, as an illustration of medieval magic. The Arabian school of medicine, which achieved great eminence during the Saracen dominion of Spain, was profoundly acquainted with botanical and metallic remedies for disease. Their erudition was subsequently bequeathed to the chemists, or rather, the alchemists of the Dark Ages, whose investigations illuminated the immense therapeutic value of metals, while concurrently inciting absurd endeavors to transmute baser minerals into gold, to discover a panacea for all ailments, or to formulate an elixir for the perpetual prolongation of life. The history of magic encompasses the governance and superstitions of antiquity, the methodologies by which those authorities maintained their sway, and the assistance they derived from the arts, sciences, and an understanding of natural phenomena. The tyrants of antiquity customarily established their sovereignty upon claims of supernatural influence, ruling under the purportedly delegated authority of heaven. The prince, the priest, and the sage were often aligned in an obscure conspiracy to deceive and subjugate their fellow beings. Mankind, mired in ignorance and perpetually subjugated by spiritual despotism, willingly surrendered to chains forged by the gods and unseen powers. Consequently, the black art, a comprehensive system of imposture nurtured by the forces of fear, given that its practitioners were presumed to be in league with the devil, was profoundly favored in early epochs. An intimate acquaintance with the celestial motions and atmospheric variations enabled its possessors to forecast astronomical and meteorological phenomena with commendable accuracy. Such capabilities could not fail to invest the practitioner with an aura of divinity. The capacity to prophesy the descent of fire from the heavens could be construed only as a divine gift. Proficiency in rendering the human body impervious to fire served as an irresistible instrument of charlatanism. Indeed, within the permutations of chemistry and the physiological influence of narcotics and soporific embrocations, ancient magicians discovered their most potent resources. The fables and miracles of bygone eras constitute a repository of evidence regarding the advanced scientific acquisitions of these mystics. The clandestine utilization of such discoveries and inventions has precluded many from surviving into the present day. Nevertheless, it is beyond dispute that nearly all branches of knowledge contributed their respective wonders to the magician's repertoire. Magic might aptly be termed the science of superstition, or the philosophy of the unknown, albeit in a sense distinct from that posited by Hartmann. The Magi, a hereditary caste of Persian priests, were the first to practice it in a formalized and systematic manner. Within the biblical texts, soothsaying and sorcery are denounced as magic, with the prophecy of Christ's birth by the wise men of the East serving as a preeminent illustration. In contemporary times, we observe the necromancy of the Greeks, the consultation of spectral entities for prophecy, and the Chinese practice of receiving oracles through mediums and the descending pencil, all imitated by modern spiritualists. Shakespeare introduces authentic magical recipes for the witch's cauldron in Macbeth, and instances of public divination by the Church of England, wherein general prayer for the victory of British bayonets against savage souls is indulged, are of no higher order than the superstition of the stranger in the teacup, or an absolute belief in faith healing. Initially, the priests served as the magicians, and the researches of Tyler, as articulated in his Primitive Culture, tend to substantiate the association of ideas that accounts for the evolution of magic, much as Fontenelle asserts that myth developed during the most rudimentary stages of a race's history. Upon the separation of magic from religion, the distinction between black and white magic emerged. The former constituted a belief in supernatural forces, such as those now designated as odic, psychic, or occult, while the latter served as a tentative precursor to the truths of science. Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria advanced magic into its pseudoscientific stage, extending it into the philosophic and theurgic forms that characterize classical science and Jewish theology. The burgeoning understanding of science and spiritual arithmetic, as one author notes, was carried to such an extreme that benevolent deities were denoted by whole numbers, and malevolent demons by fractions. Certain of the most masterful deceptions orchestrated by ancient sorcerers were facilitated by the science of acoustics. The replication of thunder within subterranean temples was employed to signify the presence of a supernatural agent. The golden virgins, whose ravishing voices resounded through the Temple of Delphi, the stone from the river Pactolus, whose trumpet notes deterred the robber from the treasure it guarded, the speaking marble head, which delivered its oracular responses at Lesbos, and the vocal statue of Memnon, which commenced at the break of day to greet the rising sun. These were all artifices derived from scientific principles and the diligent observation of natural phenomena. The principles of hydrostatics proved equally advantageous in the craft of deception. Consequently, the marvelous fountain described by Pliny on the island of Andros, which discharged wine for 7 days and water for the remainder of the year, the spring of oil that erupted in Rome to herald the return of Augustus from the Sicilian Wars, the 3 empty urns that miraculously filled with wine at the annual feast of Bacchus in the city of Elis, the glass tomb of Belus, replete with oil, which, once emptied by Xerxes, could never be replenished, the weeping statues, and the perpetual lamps, all these were manifest effects of fluid equilibrium and pressure. Furthermore, the mechanical proficiency of the philosophers of antiquity is astoundingly demonstrated by the Egyptian obelisks and the colossal masses of transported stone hoisted to prodigious heights during the erection of temples, which remain standing marvels to this day. The forces they employed and the mechanisms by which they operated have been studiously concealed. It appears that mechanical contrivances formed a substantial component of their religious impostures. When, during certain infamous mysteries of ancient Rome, unfortunate victims were ostensibly abducted by the gods, there is reason to believe they were whisked away by the power of machinery. And when Apollonius, guided by Indian sages to the temple of their deity, felt the earth rising and falling beneath his feet like an agitated sea, he was undoubtedly positioned upon a moving floor capable of simulating the heaving of waves. The rapid descent of those who consulted the oracle in the cave of Trophonius, the moving tripods that Apollonius observed in the temples, the ambulatory statues at Antium and within the temples of Hierapolis, and the wooden pigeon of Arcadus stand as prime specimens of the mechanical resources available to ancient magic. But, among all the disciplines, optics has perhaps proven the most fertile in yielding marvelous expedients. The capacity to bring the remotest objects within the observer's grasp, and to magnify the nearly invisible bodies of the material world to gigantic proportions, never fails to inspire astonishment even among those who comprehend the methods by which such prodigies are achieved. The ancients, to be sure, were unacquainted with the specific combinations of lenses and mirrors that constitute the telescope and the microscope. However, they must have been intimately familiar with the properties of glass required to project both erect and inverted images of objects. There is ample reason to surmise that they utilized these principles to conjure apparitions of their gods. Indeed, in several descriptions of the optical displays that hallowed their ancient temples, one can recognize all the visual transformations characteristic of the modern phantasmagoria. In the allegorical and mythical tales of the Middle Ages, a certain dreadful personage is consistently depicted as taking particular delight in the cunning manipulation of human affairs. Variously known as the Devil, Satan, Robin Goodfellow, and other such monikers, he was apparently believed by some theologians to maintain an alluring park, abundantly stocked with dead sea fruit, for the delectation of travelers proceeding along the high road to his heated realm, a domain known by an entirely different appellation. Nor was the belief in the intercession of an unseen third party exclusive to Christians. Traces of a similar conviction are evident in Greece, as well as in the East, and the Athenians were notably suspicious of anything that appeared to portend exceptional good fortune. Extravagant favors of fortune were regarded as harbingers of impending mischief, distrusted much as the golden casket was by the prudent Bassanio. Perhaps the tale of the sirens is intended to impart a moral of a similar nature. However the introduction of this enigmatic intermediary may be accounted for, the one paramount fact underlying all magic is that specific means are adopted for its consummation. It would border on blasphemy to argue by analogy, contrasting mundane magic with the workings of the deity. Nevertheless, this intermediary theory, echoed incidentally in the popular Spanish proverb where the devil cannot go himself, he sends an old woman, will be shown to wield as profound an influence in superstitious matters as it is credited with in the less poetic sphere of everyday life. To state these facts, however, is one matter. To explain and interpret them is quite another. It is inevitably observed that no science or creed has ever been initiated without a travesty of its inherent virtues or vices trailing behind it like a shadow. Just as the charlatan follows in the wake of the physician, as the trickeries of art pursue the genuine artist, and as religionism, the mockery of true religion, shadows true Christianity, so too do the necromancer and the magician stalk the path of the scientist. In periods of general skepticism, curiously enough, credulity becomes exceedingly rife. While the educated Greeks scoffed at their supposed deities, the fanaticism of the Athenian populace grew more furious than ever. Purveyors of magic thrived in Rome precisely when Jupiter, Mars, and Venus had been reduced to objects of mockery. Mesmer and Cagliostro conducted a remarkably successful trade in France, spawning hundreds of imitators less than a century ago. In England, during approximately the same era, the Cock Lane Ghost and Joanna Southcott found devout believers not only among the ignorant but were also particularly favored by weak-minded men of intellect. The credulity of the present epoch is equally notable. Consider the theosophist craze. Here is an ancient Asiatic creed, arising from a distinct state of civilization, which purportedly centers upon a monastery somewhere in the Central East, where the magical secrets of nature, long since revealed by the Mahatmas to the faithful, are jealously treasured. Spiritualism is but a more vulgar manifestation of the same delusion, for the esoteric Buddhist is similarly accompanied by his spirits. Then there are the thought readers. Hundreds hasten to believe in some exceptional supernatural faculty, only to lose all interest the moment it is traced back to an ordinary natural law. Indeed, such modern magicians are implicitly trusted by a class of men and women who are unspeakably scornful of priests and confessors. It would seem that a yearning for the mystical constitutes, among the educated, one of the defining characteristics of our time. Meanwhile, among the broader masses, there is no pronounced growth of anything save apathy, unless one accepts a potent mixture of base religious fanaticism and a revolt against jinn, a mixture not entirely devoid of the eroticism to which certain forms of religious fervor so readily lend themselves. Yet, there is no genuinely novel form of credulity here, nor any unprecedented attempt to captivate the minds of the masses through a feigned possession of occult powers. Salvationists, gripped by ecstasy, exhibit an approach very closely akin to the follies of the convulsionaries. Altogether, it would appear that the inherited propensity to believe in the absence of evidence, stemming from an epoch when humanity possessed no recorded documentation regarding any phenomenon and, consequently, lacked any conception of natural law, is perpetually resurfacing in the most improbable locales and eras. Chapter 3. Instinct for Mystery. The profound uncertainty and mysteriousness of life, alongside the majority of its affairs, leave little room for astonishment at mankind's extraordinary credulity in matters that, owing to a lack of comprehension, are described as supernatural or inscrutable. Our forebears harbored a deep affinity for mysteries in both trivial and momentous affairs, and even the mere secrecy of an enigma possessed a distinct allure for them. The ancient world revered oracles, exalted the mysteries of Eleusis and Isis as the crowning glories of such worship, and portrayed the Sphinx as incapable of surviving the mortification of encountering a riddle solver more astute than herself. During the Middle Ages, architects constructed edifices replete with concealed staircases and hidden chambers. Painters demonstrated mastery in cryptic allegorical allusions. Authors shrouded their meanings in peculiar phrasing, and the purveyors of anagrams, wordplay, conundrums, and all similar iterations of ingenious trifling flourished abundantly. Even concerning the simple matter of a date, the ancient builder favored presenting it in the guise of a chronogram rather than carving it in unadorned Roman or Arabic numerals. The very disposition that compelled our ancestors to place their faith in the outcomes of trials by ordeal and wagers of battle likely predisposed them to trust in the serendipity of a fortuitous guess in gambling and when executing critical personal decisions. Within the folklore of numerous nations, we possess records of the objective manifestations through which the instinct for mystery has left its indelible mark. Such legends have evolved in tandem with the historical realities of a populace and the dogmas of their creed. The Greeks and Romans possessed their own fanciful traditions. The devout Muslim maintains a repository of lore derived from sources beyond the Quran, and the Talmud encompasses traditions absent from the scriptures. Even less civilized nations embellish their limited repository of ideas with myriad legendary additions. However, the richest harvests are to be gleaned from the beliefs of medieval Christianity. The legends prevalent throughout the Middle Ages are alternately charming, grotesque, ludicrous, profane, sublime, or terrifying, a peculiar dichotomy of abject devotion and, From the perspective of modern sensibilities, bizarre profanity, characterized by both exaggerated reverence and gross irreverence, permeates these tales. Men believed implicitly in the sanctity of a shrine, approaching it solely upon their knees, except on the Feast of Asses, when those selfsame devout worshippers introduced a donkey into the church, parroted their holiest rites, intoned profane songs, and misused sacred vessels, all entirely bereft of any consciousness of transgression. Priest and presbyter alike harbored a lingering superstition that a knife must not be left facing upwards, lest it cut the angels swarming in the air. These angels serving merely as a Christianized designation for the genie slain by the Eastern merchant with a carelessly discarded date stone. On more than one occasion, contemporary church restorers, while meticulously scraping whitewash from anciently painted walls, have uncovered frescoes that would profoundly offend modern sensibilities of decency. Yet, these had been tolerated by successive generations of pious devotees. When examining an ancient miracle play, complete with its coarse jests and profane treatment of sacred names, one is naturally inclined to marvel. Indeed, we learn that only individuals of the utmost moral character were selected to perform in the pageant. Furthermore, when Adam and Eve were required to process through the streets naked, these roles were assumed by the most respectable youths of the town, who participated in the mystery play with the same earnestness they would devote to a solemn religious service. There must surely have existed a profound and peculiar sanction of mystery to account for such phenomena. Our forebears devoutly maintained that the earth was inhabited by a multitude of entities beyond the lineage of Adam. Popular superstition populated the mines and caverns with gnomes, and the shadowed forests with fairies and goblins, while the air, the water, and the fire were all presumed to teem with living creatures. Mankind walked the earth perpetually surrounded by a host of spiritual beings. What modern society haltingly describes as the forces of nature were, to our ancestors, actual and living personalities. It remains difficult to adequately account for the origin of such beliefs. Why did they emerge in response to this human craving for mystery? Many represent distinct survivals of pagan doctrine, with Dryads and Nereides retaining belief under alternative appellations. Certain religious legends are evidently allegorical, likely posited as such in their genesis, only to be subsequently interpreted as factual history by less poetic imaginations. Others are unambiguous fabrications, appended as if to bridge the lacunae within sacred or historical records. As recently as the 18th century, a pious priest meticulously recomposed segments of the Old Testament, amplifying descriptions wherever he deemed it necessary and inserting fabricated conversations wherever he perceived the original dialogue to be meager. The ancient transcribers of the Gospels or the lives of the saints engaged in much the same practice, continuing until the infancy Gospels were appended to the records of the evangelists, and the Acta Sanctorum expanded into an ever-burgeoning volume. Countless legends may well have proliferated in a comparable manner. Yet, the salient point of such illustrations lies in the indubitable fact that they catered to human desires which, for lack of a superior designation, are termed mysterious. It can scarcely be doubted that an innate instinct for mystery resides within mankind, arising in part from the inherent limitations of human faculties, and in part from our unfathomable ignorance. This instinct invariably inclines the mind toward the superstitious, toward a stealthy conviction in an animating soul of nature. The poet, the mystic, the spiritualist, the moral idealist, whosoever has deeply loved or profoundly suffered, will refuse to entertain any conclusion that precludes the hope of an explanation beyond the grave, existing beyond the strict confines of mortal knowledge. Is death the absolute terminus of the mind, that wondrous essence so laboriously gathered and distilled across countless epochs? Or might it be that, concerning the mind as with matter, there exists a law of conservation that strictly precludes its annihilation? We cannot, therefore, wonder that the world remains steeped in superstition. Nor can we marvel that animism, the explanation of all natural phenomena through spiritual agency, remains as prevalent today as in primitive antiquity, when mankind personified the forces of nature and ascribed the inexplicable to the dominion of a hidden, indwelling deity. Christianity itself, as Ørsted observes, could not eradicate the specific brand of superstition that sought succor from the devil. Indeed, even the most materialistic mind continues to seek the spiritual within the material, harboring suspicions that there exists more than a mere casual connection between superstitious faith and poetry. None can feign that the profound mystery of birth, alongside the awakening from unconsciousness to a conscious state devoid of foresight, does not constitute the fertile soil from which all that is mysterious stems. How and why we exist in our current state represents a metaphysical entanglement that the Pythagorean and the Buddhist endeavor to unravel through the doctrine of transmigration, the Platonist through the doctrine of preexistence, Christianity through the belief in a singular future existence, and the majority of religious systems and philosophies through the postulation of an alternate existence of some variety. To die, to sleep perchance to dream, there's the rub. This marks the veritable climax of human knowledge. This is the impervious rock upon which all certitude is inevitably shattered. For my own part, I submit that consciousness may fluctuate upon a vast continuum, from that of the worm to that of man, from base sensation to the divine inspiration of Jesus, and that there may indeed exist states of unconsciousness far grander and more desirable than consciousness itself. The sweet dream, the consuming self-hypnosis of the Oriental devotee, or the profound nirvana of mental detachment may serve, to some degree, to illustrate my precise intent. In accordance with Richter, I cannot conceive that the world will be rendered a mere world machine, God a blind force, and the hereafter a coffin. There may exist ineffable modes of being, not the mere blank non-being posited by Schopenhauer, nor the nirvana of the Buddhists, which constitutes a mere shedding of all our present modes of consciousness, sensation, desire, aspiration, and thought, regarding them as hindrances rather than aids to felicity and peace. I do not imply that the unconscious existence of the stone, the wave, or the cloud, nor absolute nonentity, the sudden precipitation into eternal darkness, and our ultimate reduction to naught, constitute the sole prospects following death. I do believe, however, that if existence must be bifurcated into the conscious and the unconscious, such a division is profoundly inaccurate. The term unconscious denotes merely the absence of consciousness. Yet, the sphere designated as unconscious may encompass a vastly greater domain than the conscious realm. It may harbor modes of being wherein conditions superior to consciousness find a place, states transcending the poet's vision of beauty, the lover's paradise, the enthusiast's rapture, or the sage's tranquility. This uncharted continent between consciousness and annihilation, widely termed the unconscious, contains the roots of all that we designate as religious, superstitious, mysterious, and inscrutable. Chapter 4. Spirits and Fairy Lore. It is a rather melancholy truth that the world grows more prosaic and dreary as it ages. The world has never been a merry place, Sheldon observes, since the fairies ceased their dancing. Alas, It is not that the fairies have abandoned their revelries, but rather that the collective wisdom of the world has grown too obtuse to perceive them. Fairy revels upon yellow sands or within the moonlit glades of the forest are as frequent today as they were when Oberon and Titania quarreled, and when Puck made an ass of Bottom the Weaver in the Athenian woods. Yet, we now deem as foolish those quaint folk of old who readily imagined the sylvan and floral realms to be populated by blithe intelligences, and who easily attributed to every blossom some spiritual significance, poetic fancy, or the embodiment of a religious legend or tradition. No longer do we peer into the dainty bells of the wild foxglove to recognize the hiding places of fairies, nor can we imagine that the mushroom rings in the meadows are fairy circles, where delicate creatures with gossamer wings tripped the light fantastic toe while mortals slumbered. School boards and scientific primers have tolled the death knell of such whimsical conceits. There exists one distinguishing characteristic that appears to differentiate the fairy from every other entity of a similar order. Whereas most spirits possessed the capacity to contract their mass at will, the fairy alone was regarded as intrinsically diminutive in stature. Dwarfs, brownies, and similar entities are depicted as malformed creatures, whereas the fairy is customarily portrayed as a beautiful miniature of the human being, flawless in both visage and form. The genesis of fairy superstition is attributed by the majority of authors to the Celtic peoples. However, the Gothic tribes introduced malevolent attributes, amalgamating the elfin and dwarfish malignancy of the northern spirits with the traits proper to fairies. In Scotland, fairies were known as the good neighbors or men of peace. The malevolent spirits were dedicated to the abduction of human beings, particularly unchristened infants. In Ireland to this day, should a young woman fall victim to puerperal fever, the more unlettered among the rural populace believe she has been spirited away to serve as a nursemaid to the fairies. Fairies are invariably represented as dwelling in societies akin to those of mankind, governed by a monarchical system. The Salic law did not prevail among them, for accounts speak more frequently of fairy queens than of fairy kings. Their dominion was situated somewhere beneath the earth. The true origin of fairies remains shrouded in a mythological mist. Tradition dictates that during Lucifer's war in heaven, the angelic host was divided into 3 factions. The first comprised the supporters of the Omnipotent, the second, the followers of the Great Apostate, and the third consisted of those who refused to pledge allegiance to either power. This final class, according to the legend, was cast from heaven into the winds and waters, where they are condemned to remain ignorant of their ultimate fate until the day of judgment. This modest fable is somewhat more ancient than the narrative of the fall of man. From a very early epoch, all fairy annalists have concurred in bestowing upon the king and queen of the fairies the names Oberon and Titania. Oberon was the Elbrich or rich elf of the Germanic traditions, and was endowed with his medieval nomenclature by the old French romancers. They represented him as a diminutive creature of immense beauty, wearing a jeweled crown upon his head and bearing a horn whose notes compelled all who heard them to dance. The fairies' power to render themselves invisible enabled them to execute a myriad of peculiar antics. German sprites, those larcenous little beings addicted to pilfering the farmers' crops of peas, are generally outfitted with a magic cap when embarking upon their mischievous errands. One of the elfin princesses in Andersen's tales possesses the convenient faculty of vanishing simply by placing a wand into her mouth. Similarly, Shakespeare, the preeminent poet upon the subject, whose Queen Mab has nearly usurped Titania, attributes to his fairies this capacity for rendering themselves unseen. Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Prospero in The Tempest both declare their power to achieve invisibility. Indeed, in the vast majority of fairy legends and folktales, this superhuman quality of disappearing at will is amply illustrated. Even today, many a German peasant refuses to frequent certain localities for fear of falling under the irresistible influence of these unseen entities. In some regions of the continent, when a fierce hurricane rages, the phenomenon is regarded by many as nothing less than one of the chief fairies making her invisible circuit. When the wind howls loudly in West Flanders, the people share a grim refrain. Hark, Alvina weeps. Alvina was the daughter of a king. On account of her marriage, she was cursed by her parents to wander forever invisible, much like the fairies. Malevolent spirits occupy a macabre and fearsome place within tradition. Everyone is familiar with elf arrows, those mythical fairy weapons, discharged primarily for destructive purposes, which are likely a vestige of the Stone Age. Not content with the tactical advantage of waging war in invisible armor, nor with the spiritual potency of Neolithic arrowheads, these wicked creatures abducted children, as previously noted. Consequently, in Scotland, various charms were employed to secure their restoration. The most efficacious method was believed to be the roasting of the supposititious child, or changeling, which the fairies had left in place of the kidnapped infant. It was understood that the false babe would thus vanish, leaving the true infant in its stead. The possession of what are termed toadstones was likewise held to be an effective preservative against the abduction of children by the fairies. The introduction of the banshee in the following stanza of a keening, an Irish term denoting a wild song of lamentation, poured forth over a corpse during the wake ceremony by specific mourners employed for that purpose, indicates the prevailing popular sentiment upon the subject. 'Twas the banshee's lonely wailing, well I knew the voice of death in the night wind slowly sailing o'er the bleak and gloomy heath. This banshee was a mysterious personage, generally regarded as the harbinger of some approaching misfortune. Such superstition was not confined solely to Ireland. Several families within the Scottish Highlands formerly laid claim to the distinction of an attendant spirit that performed the function of the Irish banshee, an office which, according to Sir Walter Scott, honored the passing of only those family members possessing pure Milesian blood. Welsh clans possess yet another iteration of the banshee in the form of the Saihirith. Though it remains forever unseen, the noise it produces is dreadful enough to instill sheer terror in all who hear it. As a further illustration, too, of how superstitions travel from one country to another, we are informed that, in America, there are tales of the banshee imported from Ireland along with the sons of that soil. Countless stories of an absurd nature have been recounted concerning the interaction of fairies with mankind. Certain of the wretched individuals arraigned in past eras for witchcraft admitted, under the duress of torture, to having maintained correspondence with fairies. The trials of Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson, in the years 1576 and 1588, in Scotland, illustrate this assertion. Yet the unfortunate creatures who confessed their intercourse with fairyland could not so easily save themselves. They were convicted and burned at the stake. It can scarcely be doubted that these animistic beings have shared some common source, and that martyrdom was frequently the consequence of a sincere belief in their existence. In a primitive condition of the world's races, human energy found an outlet in the imagination, and the vagaries of which this faculty is capable remain truly unlimited. The conviction that men's souls departed their bodies at death to drift through the air until they discovered some other habitat into which they could transmigrate readily adapted itself to an objective explanation. Vestiges of fairy lore may be detected within the populous pantheons of antiquity, in the fates of the Romans who presided over birth and influenced destiny, the Peri of the Persians, the malignant Jays of the Middle Ages, and the dynasty of Pluto and Proserpine to which Chaucer alludes. In the Eddas, the elves and hobgoblins are depicted as dwelling within the clay, much in the manner that worms ensconce themselves within human flesh. Plutarch highlights the almost immemorial prevalence of the belief in two opposing principles, one the author of good, and the other the author of evil. Naturally, it was a simple matter to graft upon each of these the concepts of auxiliary spirits for and against, the hosts being commanded on the one side by the good power, and on the other by the bad, who subsequently became known as the devil. Christianity merely altered the manner of regarding these creatures, but I shall defer a detailed consideration of this phase of the subject to another chapter, wherein demonology will receive due treatment. These superstitions remain far from extinct in the British Islands. It is scarcely more than a century ago that the belief in supernatural intermediaries was commonplace among all classes. Today the belief is but little diminished. The austere and fervent religion of Scotland is not the sole system of the afterlife which is responsible for the faith in the physical manifestation of devils. Those malicious pranks of Satan in assaulting ministers, waylaying travelers, and disturbing families while at worship are merely illustrative of the same instinct which induced the fantasy of fairy beings. It was not only in the air and upon the land that the invisible entities exercised their dominion. Mermen and mermaids, those sirens of the ocean who were presumed to be such terrors to overly trusting navigators, along with the water imps and witches, have occupied a prominent place among the legends of the river and sea demons. The Rosicrucians, designated by a play upon the name of their founder as followers of the Rosy Cross, constitute a comparatively recent body of believers who are largely responsible for theosophy and similar fancies, which are but a modernized reflection of what they taught. Demonstrating more grace than demonology, the philosophy of Rosenkreutz has found annotation in the sylphs, Ariels, and sylphids of Shakespeare and other English poets, and has furnished thematic conceits for Fouquet's Undine, Bulwer's Zanoni, Dr. Mackay's Salamandrine, and other literary musings. It was a curious and charming creed that the elements swarmed not with ghouls, but with angels, far more disposed to be kind than cruel. Given an earth inhabited by gnomes, the air by sylphs, the fire by salamanders, and the water by nymphs or undines, and the mystic mind can readily conclude that the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, the essence of invisibility, the secret of omnipotence, and perpetual motion are all within grasp. But in this, as in most systems, the difficulty of the intermediary emerges once more. Communication with the unseen powers ought to render the problems of philosophy no longer a puzzle. But there remains something fundamentally flawed with the medium. It is easy to deduce that factors beyond mere ignorance are responsible for these superstitions. True, when the human mind permits itself to fixate upon and agonize over ordinary matters as phenomena directed by invisible agents, such as spirits, demons, apparitions, charms, there is no limiting the powers they are presumed to exercise. But ignorance is not solely responsible for this peculiar mental or emotional or hereditary weakness. Chapter 5. Primitive Medical Traditions. Sir Charles Bell asserted that human sufferings and human credulity yield a never-failing harvest, for quackery is an evil. which walks unchecked and triumphs in the sun. The prevailing belief in days of antiquity was that, as diseases were produced by supernatural power, so they were to be cured by it. In the history of European civilization, it is observed that barbarous peoples invariably ascribe to their benevolent or malevolent deities not merely extraordinary ailments, but many of the ordinary diseases to which humanity is susceptible. Throughout Europe, the conception of disease as possessing a supernatural origin long maintained its hold, and, within our own country, such a notion naturally fostered all manner of quackery. The sweeping witchcraft movement afforded abundant opportunities for its practitioners to execute their spells, survivals of which continue to linger in many a rural village. The profound credulity of former centuries regarding matters of healing is evidenced by the Act of Henry VIII, expressly enacted to protect wise women and others who were presumed to heal through their magical arts, such persons being described as endowed by God with the knowledge of herbs, roots, and waters. Consequently, anyone who foraged for herbs and professed the ability to eradicate disease by occult means was submitted to with unquestioning faith. Thus, tumors, upon their counsel, were believed to be removed by stroking them with the hand of a deceased man, and splinters from a hangman's tree or scaffold worn as amulets were deemed a most efficacious remedy against ague. These medieval charlatans were more or less endorsed by the learned minds of their era. The man of science was generally something of an alchemist, and the students of medicine were typically extensive purveyors of charms and philters. The apothecary himself stood as ready to vend love philters to a maiden as narcotics to a friar. Lord Bacon posited it as a credible notion that precious stones possessed the virtue to cure maladies, and Sir Thomas Browne maintained a belief in witchcraft to the selfsame end. In 1553 Cecil, the forebear of Lord Salisbury, was advised by Lord Audley to place his reliance in the healing virtues of a 9-day-old sow pig, distilled with various herbs and spices, and as late as 1829 Mr. Forster, infected with that selfsame spirit, authored a treatise to prove that epidemics are due to the shocks of clashing comets. Numerous persons of elevated station submitted to the ceremony of healing by the royal touch, and it is recorded that Charles II touched approximately 92,000 individuals. William III regarded the practice as utterly foolish, and upon the singular occasion he laid his hand on a patient. He said, "God give you better health and more sense." It is requisite to consider the condition of primitive man before any clear conception in regard to the mythical bearing of the art of medicine can be attained. We find that the earliest religions encompassed the concept of demons, which are merely the spirits of a more or less modified soul, whether that of an animal or a human being, a stick or a stone. The savage observed that the singular difference between the living body and the dead was breath. Hence the breath which departed the dying man was his very life, and his life or soul passed into the atmosphere, where it continued to exist, in the form of a spirit or demon, a notion upon which the modern spiritualist has made but little improvement. In their dreams and deranged nervous conditions, prehistoric peoples beheld visions which, had they possessed a spectroscope, they would have recognized were not ghost souls. Consequently, in instances of disease among less advanced societies, the morbid condition of both the patient's body and mind led them to conclude that they were possessed by a malevolent spirit. Thereafter, to appease the demon's wrath, their companions offered sacrifices, much as a devout Catholic pays a priest to secure the release of a friend's soul from purgatory, and resorted to exorcisms, charms, and incantations designed to banish the unseen malevolence. This represents one phase of totemism, the primitive belief in a guardian demon, whether animal, vegetable, or mineral that was common to all early communities. As previously stated, it was believed that not only did human beings possess souls, but animals, plants, inanimate objects, the stars, the earth, the thunder, the sun, the moon, and the sky were all similarly endowed. It was therefore natural for primitive man to worship and offer sacrifices to these nature souls, which he feared and could not subjugate. His sole conception of force was one modeled in his own likeness, albeit invisible. Accordingly, he conceived of deities, superior powers corresponding to various types of men, thereby originating anthropomorphism. It was observed that the rising of the stars was analogous to the phenomenon of birth. This, alongside other analogies, led to the fancied relationship between the celestial bodies and the human constitution. Centuries later, alchemy is found engaged in seeking this correspondence between metals and the planets, the celestial Mercury and the chemical Mercury, for example, while astrology lends its aid to the cosmic search for the elixir of life and the secret of perpetual rejuvenation. During the Middle Ages, Paracelsus systematized these beliefs, explaining that the human body was a microcosm corresponding to the macrocosm, and that it contained within itself all elements of visible nature: the sun, the moon, the stars, and the poles of heaven. Accordingly, it was incumbent upon the physician to study external nature, for diseases were deemed not natural, but spiritual in origin. In this manner arose the famous doctrine of signatures, the proposition that inherent signs indicate the virtues and applications of natural objects. This doctrine stood as one of the most prevalent theories of bygone eras. Aided by Bohm, it crystallized the early faith in sympathy, which I shall demonstrate to be the lineal predecessor of what are known today as hypnotism, spiritual healing, electrobiology, and similar practices. According to its tenets, it was believed that objects, by virtue of their external characteristics, indicated the specific maladies for which nature had intended them as remedies. Thus, it was asserted that the properties of substances were frequently denoted by their color. White was regarded as cooling, and red as hot. For disorders of the blood, burnt purple, pomegranates, mulberries, and other red ingredients were dissolved into the patient's drink, whereas yellow substances were recommended for hepatic complaints. Pliny wrote of the folly of magicians employing catenance in love potions, though the practice prevailed for centuries thereafter. In his Art of Simpling, Coles elucidates how God has imprinted a distinct form upon herbs, providing them with particular signs or signatures by which mankind may discern their proper uses. Malignant plants, for instance, revealed their nature through the somber and melancholic appearance of their leaves, flowers, or fruit. Euphrasia or eyebright was supposed to be beneficial for the eyes, owing to a dark, pupil-like spot within its corolla. Milton depicts the archangel clarifying the vision of Adam and Eve by its means, and Spencer speaks of it in a similar strain. Ginseng was reputed by the Chinese and Native Americans to possess virtues deduced from its root, which bears a resemblance to the human body. The Romans possessed a rock-breaking plant known as saxifraga, which was considered efficacious in the cure of calculus complaints, hence its popular moniker, stone-breaking. It was once believed that fern seeds could induce invisibility, a notion Shakespeare has Gadshill mention in Henry IV. The walnut was deemed beneficial for mental afflictions due to its resemblance to the structure of the human head. Our Lady's thistle, on account of its numerous prickles, was recommended for stitches in the side, and nettle tea remains popular to this day for cases of nettle rash. The barberry tree and turmeric, both being yellow plants, were prescribed for jaundice. For ague, quaking grass was utilized, and as the cones of the pine tree resemble 4 teeth, pine leaves boiled in vinegar were employed for the relief of toothaches. Lungwort, or the Jerusalem cowslip, was administered for pulmonary diseases, and water soldier for gunshot wounds. The connection drawn between roses and blood is indeed curious. On the continent, it is a widespread notion. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.